Thanks for joining us Behind the Frontline, a podcast providing timeless solutions to everyday workforce and workplace challenges. Frontline Training Solutions is an express employment professionals company, strategically placed between the workplace and the workforce with professionals standing by, ready to combat your unique challenges. Learn more about what we do at frontlineon.com. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us again for another podcast here at Behind the Frontline. And today we are talking about generational intelligence. And I'm sitting here in the studio with Ryan Williams, who is our Leadership and Team Development Manager. Say hi, Ryan.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, and we're also sitting here with Lorraine Medici, who is our Director of Training and Development here at Frontline Training Solutions. Hey, Lorraine.
Hello. Hi, guys.
All right. And I'm the Creative Director here, and I think we're going to have a good conversation because we have two of the world's foremost thought-leading experts on generational intelligence, at least to me. So I think we're going to have a good conversation.
It's a very small world.
I think this is a hot topic because this is something that's ever changing. You know, it's always one generation coming out, one generation coming in, and this is the first time really in how long that we have 4 different generations represented in the workplace right now.
It's kind of been that way for a bit, but yeah, you're right. One goes in, one goes out, and for a while, I don't know if you would agree with this. It was a very hot topic. Like in 2015 and 16, we were doing a lot of generational trainings, because that was kind of the pivotal years when millennials now became the biggest generation in the workforce, and baby boomers were no longer the biggest generation. And then things kind of...
The power shift.
Yeah, definitely the power shift. Yeah. And then things kind of slowed down with people wanting to... But you're right, it is definitely being brought back on the scene. And I think that's because we're seeing Gen Zs coming into the workforce. And I just want to make sure we're definitely keeping this to the workforce, generations in the workforce, yeah.
So as we're thinking about generations in the workforce, we talk about emotional intelligence, we talk about, other forms of intelligence, but we've been throwing around this term a lot, generational intelligence. So I just want to know from you guys, why do you think generational intelligence is so critical in today's workplace?
Yeah, I think we've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, studying, researching, and that term, is coming up more and more, generational intelligence. And we said, okay, how would we define that? It's because it is a pretty relatively new term. I think about it closely related with cultural intelligence. I think in many ways we would define cultural intelligence. And so what we put together is this ability to recognize and appreciate the unique attributes of each generation, because I think we can say there are some unique attributes and experiences or worldviews that different generations have. But in the same time, the intelligence part, I think, is, obviously recognizing those differences, but then also actively resisting biases and stereotypes or the weaponizing of those differences. So the intelligence is recognizing what's actually helpful and what's not, what's going to create division versus true understanding, right? So the intelligence is really, in some words, I think I like the word wisdom to kind of parse through that with some intentionality. So generational intelligence, I think many would say cultural intelligence is in some way a similar idea, and we might even use a similar idea of culture, right? Gen Zs create a certain kind of culture. Boomers we grew up in different culture with different cultural values on some level, being elevated or celebrated. So I think there's a lot to be said there, but I think it's a very new idea. I like the idea because I think it starts to frame our thinking around it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We did a webinar on this topic not that long ago, right?
Yeah, it's been a little bit, but yeah.
I know in the webinar you talked a little bit about the different generations. Can you just give us an overview of the different generations in the workforce and some of their maybe key characteristics?
Yes, and Ryan, feel free to jump in, but a really good source for looking up things on generations is the Pew Research Center. They would say that let's start with baby boomers would have been born 1946 to 1964. The Gen X would have been 65 to about 78, 79. Millennials, let's say 79 to 92. And then we've got our Gen Zs from 93 on, I'd say approximately. Am I off on that?
No, I think you're. It's funny because when you go and ask somebody from those generations, it's like, no, I'm part of this generation. There's those people that are always in the in-betweeners, right?
That's right.
And we want to identify with one or the other.
Well, so and there's a reason why we do that. But so traditionally, and I'll be really honest, I remember even when I was doing some of this generational training 8 years ago, I wasn't super comfortable with it because I didn't buy into the boxes. I didn't buy into the labels. Just for historical reasons, I think this is a really important piece. The term generations, as we know it today, that didn't even exist until the baby boomers were born. If you go back and you look at some of the history, a generation was considered the dad of the family had a son who had a son, and it was purely based on a biological, right? Just having children.
Familial generations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that helped keep people in kind of a tribal understanding and, like you said, a familial unit. The whole idea of generations didn't really come about until the baby boomer generation, which they still say is the purest based on that historical understanding. So after World War II, we had this enormous birth rate skyrocket, and that was a shift. And that went until about 1964, and then all of a sudden you see the birth rate crash. And after that, the subsequent generations are no longer based on the same specs that the baby boomer generation. It's not based on, Gen X now is the next one for the next 15 years. I mean, they're like the smallest. I think it's 13 years. What changed for each of those generations was based on some big technological, sociological, economic, where we saw this shift in culture to go, okay, now this is a new group that's going through something.
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
You see people now having to react and respond to their environment, the change, something happened. And so then people start to think and shift in value. I mean, even what we value starts to shift and change in response to what's happening around us. And so then we start to identify, and we'll talk about patterns that we start to see.
Yeah. Some of the research that I was looking at, is when you go back 300-400 years, is it was very common for children to want to replicate what their parents did, want to do things what their parents did, whether it was, art or doing a trade that their father might be doing. Well, I'm sure you ask most 25-year-olds, they're not going to want to take their mom and dad to, some place downtown and go dancing with them. It's just it's a completely different way of thinking, the differences and the disparity between parents and kids. So that said, each of these generations have been influenced by different economical, technological, social, political types of things. Ryan and I were talking about this yesterday. If you just look at the 1960s, okay, I'm a baby boomer. I'm a young baby boomer, born in 61. So in the 60s, we had at least 3 assassinations in this country. Oh, actually 4, because if you count JFK, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Oswald, who killed JFK. Some pretty major things. Then you had this huge change in culture with respect to anti-government, right? Vietnam,
distrust.
Absolutely distrust, and the hippie movement which was big, not as big as I think people think it was, but it was big. A lot of changes going on at that time. Okay, so if I was born in 1961, and we're talking about Vietnam in 1967, what was I doing? I'm like playing in a sandbox and playing with a baby doll or a Barbie or something. I don't have that. I'm not going to be a part of that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's just an interesting way of looking that most people will find themselves at that maturation point, their development at the next generation, right? So as an adult, I was really in the Gen X generation, even part of the millennial generation. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like the experiences that we're responding to are developing our beliefs. Or, experiences develop our beliefs. So when we think about how we think about things, experience is what's going to drive the beliefs we have about the world. There's other ways to think about that, but at the core, that's typically how we develop our beliefs. So as a young kid, you were, I'm sure, hearing and somewhat influenced by seeing and hearing and experiencing some of these things. But really, at your maturity level, you were experiencing but there were other people your same age that were experiencing similar things.
Sure.
And so this is where I think it can be really helpful to go, okay, so we know there's historical implications around what are we experiencing that's then shaping how we think, and what we believe about to be true about the world, our values, all of those things. So, but I was thinking about this and I was thinking there's really 3 reasons why we like to do the whole generation thing. And so it really comes back to how our brains work. The first one is we have a need. We actually have an inherent need to categorize and label things.
Absolutely.
Our brains have to categorize and we have to label things to be able to move efficiently through the world.
It's a way to navigate and make sense out of things. Right?
Yeah, our brains are driven towards efficiency. And you can talk about how we have developed throughout history as just human beings. This idea is we're built to be able to react or respond quickly. And we talk about emotional intelligence, these things when a deer runs out in front of you, well, I categorize that in my brain danger, right? So I'm going to react. But in the same way, we're trying to reduce our cognitive load. So generations is another way we do that by labeling, they're a Gen Z. Okay, they fit in that category. They fit in that label. Right. And so that's a human trait. Go around the world, across cultures, it's how our brains try to reduce cognitive load. The second thing is, along that, it's so we can predict and navigate the world. So, and then lastly is, along this, we do this so we can create social groups. Friend, stranger.
We find safety in that, don't we?
Safety. And so then we start to create in-group and out-group thinking. So back to that question, why do we create this generational frameworks? Well, I think they can be helpful because they can start for us to help to understand what in-group and out-group might mean. In-group is, for instance, what was the favorite TV show that you
grew up in when I was a child?
Yeah.
Oh, probably like the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you meet somebody else who also grew up.
Yes.
Huddled around their TV, watching the Brady Bunch or whatever. What then does that create? It creates an in-group. We have shared experiences.
Yes, it's like a bond almost.
It's
right?
a bond, and we get each other on some level. It's like, okay, so then you come to an organization. Let's talk about from this on an organizational level. You come to an organization where everybody else has also watched the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island. There you have one way to develop an in-group. Right? They experienced what it was like when the Vietnam War was raging, and we have that. It's often sometimes subconscious, but we have that sense of shared experience. This is also plays out in cultural differences, all of that. But the in-group thing and why I think we create generations, or why we feel this need to categorize or label, is to create an in-group, out-group thing. So, I mean, it's funny, me and my friends, I'm a millennial, born in 89. We talk about where we were when the 9/11 tragedy happened. And we have that. But then there's a younger person in our midst who was 2 or 3. And we go, oh, you don't remember. You're not one of us.
Yes, yes, yeah.
So we do that. It's like, you don't know what Gilligan's Island is? Come
That's
on.
right. Yeah.
Or we'll play the sound of the internet. Do you know what the internet sounds like for our younger listeners?
Mm-hmm.
You know what the internet sounds like?
I've done it for my kids.
Yeah. What do they do?
No idea what the sound is.
Yeah,
for sure.
Like, what is this?
Or ask them to hold
I don't even think I know what do you. Oh, that one.
Yeah,
oh,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah. Well,
Where
I
you
remember.
pick up the phone, you're trying to call your friend.
Yes.
And
Well, even that right there. Like, show me how you pick up a phone.
Show
Show me how you pick up a phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I asked my Gen 8 kids who are 11 and 9, how do you pick up a phone? And they both went like this.
Did they really?
Because it's a cell phone generation.
Yes.
And
Interesting.
it's a way for us to create connection and belonging.
And yeah.
And then, but then also go, who's not in?
Well, let me ask you this. Same question you asked me, and you, Nick. I know you guys are similar. You're
5 years older,
yeah,
but
but millennial.
Yeah.
So what do you remember is your favorite TV show growing up?
That's where it gets interesting for us, I think. TV is a little bit different. It starts to become spidered and splintered. There's a lot more options.
Yes, it did.
So finding shared experiences like that become a little bit more difficult. But I'm curious how you would answer that.
Oh.
If you had to pick one.
I mean, I'll just go with a very generic response of Friends, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, your parents let you watch Friends.
Yeah. My parents were cool.
Yeah. You think, okay, at what age are we talking? But I remember in high school, I got my family really into Psych.
Psych's a great show.
Psych
I love
is
that
a
show.
show.
Never
Yeah,
even heard of
I've
it.
seen it a couple times.
Yeah, I've rewatched it. I very
Seriously, I've
rarely
never even
rewatch
heard of
shows.
it.
If you
It's a
haven't
great
seen
show.
it, it's funny. It's
Okay.
good.
Very millennial humor, though.
It's very millennial humor. Yeah.
Just listening to you, based on what you just said, I immediately had a sense of, oh, I'm not with them.
Yeah.
I'm
But you haven't seen Psych?
Yeah.
No.
You're not in the in group.
no.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting when we think about, okay, why do generations exist? Yes, they can be helpful, but why do we ultimately create them? Why do we do these things? It's because we have an incessant need to label and to categorize.
And I think it's because of that, it builds in psychological safety.
Yeah.
We're very tribal, if you think about it. We're very, people are tribal. There's, if you look at how people migrated all the way through different countries, thousands of years, you went with families. You moved and shifted with small communities because there was safety in that. And I think that's still part of how we're wired a lot of ways, right?
So let's bring this into the workplace, and I'm curious about your perspective on this because
I'm old. Yes.
because you're a different generation.
Thank you.
I'm not saying you're old. Different generation. You're a young boomer.
Oh, thank you.
And I remember this, and I'm curious for Gen Z too, but I'm also curious about your perspective. And when it comes to stereotypes of different generations, I know when we entered the workforce, there's just lots of talk about, oh, you're such a millennial. Oh, those damn millennials.
Yeah.
Like you lazy.
You're this way. You're that way.
That's
right.
right.
Yep.
And
You want a pat on your back the whole time.
and I've heard that specifically about different Gen Z type stereotypes.
Yes, you have.
I'm curious, did you experience that when you were in the workforce?
Not with a label that said I was a baby boomer. I never remember, and I remember even. That's a really good question. I don't even remember being called a baby boomer. I was just more like, well, she's 22 years old. She's 24 years old.
A kid.
But we weren't really labeled a baby boomer until I was a much older adult in my 30s. That's a very interesting thing. So the stereotypes had to do much more about the things that we have here every single time we have somebody who's probably entering the workforce. They're lazy. They don't want to work. I remember growing up, and my dad would say, listen, there were times where I had no soles in my shoe or a big hole in and we had to walk 5 miles. Well, that's right. That's right.
We all heard the same story.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had it harder than you.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Right. So, okay, well, there's something to that, right? There's something that's not really a generational thing. I think that's just more of a
maturity thing.
I think it's a development piece,
stage of life.
It is.
I've really started to dive into this, but I think you bring up that's a really good question. And the labeling thing of millennials. I remember, so when I was in college, one of my biggest areas of study was adolescent development, and stages of development into adulthood. And so I was doing a lot of research, and, so this is early 2000s when I'm in college, and generations study and trends and understanding, and again, that categorizing and that understanding and it can be helpful. But one of the things, so Twenge, Twenge, if anybody wants to look her up, she's a researcher, did a lot of research into generations, and a lot of it is really helpful. But one of the things that I think was maybe unhelpful was one of the studies she did came out and said, well, millennials are more narcissistic than any other generation. I went, oh, thank you for that.
Well, and when you told me that, the first thing I went, well, what's the evidence of that?
Right. And I would say the study was actually done relatively well. It was a psych test that everybody took, but it's like based on what exactly? And so generally there's like, well, if I have had a bad experience with somebody I would label as a millennial, then I go, oh, well, then I get to what we would say is confirmation bias. I then look for traits or evidence that will support that belief that every millennial is narcissistic, right? So, and then I ignore any evidence that contradicts that.
Yeah, that refutes what you're...
That refutes this pre-existing belief. So I was like, thank you, Twenge. Now, not that her research isn't potentially helpful, but dangerous, right? On some level, and kind of frustrating as somebody coming into the workforce who doesn't necessarily appreciate the label that we're more narcissistic.
Well, that is a pretty negative label. I don't know how else you get around that. There's nothing really redeeming about narcissism, right?
Right.
So if I hang on to that, we talk a lot in emotional intelligence that our thoughts drive our feelings drive our behaviors, which I don't know if you want to get into some of these differences now, but for instance, because we had this really good conversation, what is the difference between stereotypes, biases, prejudices, and discrimination? And I don't think we take enough time to really delve into understanding the meanings of words. So doing some of this in preparation for our conversation, stereotype, and I just took some notes down here, but stereotype is sort of a generalized, broad brush stroke of some opinions I feel. Okay, sort of like I might say, I think all Gen Zs don't want to work 40 hours a week. Okay, you talk to a lot of baby boomers, they would probably agree to the same thing, right? Okay, but let's say that's what I hang on to my head. So I'm thinking that's my thought. Moving that into a feeling is either going to go towards bias or prejudice. So what do those two mean? Now, bias here, and again, this is got from the dictionary, is a tendency or an inclination toward or against something, often based on personal experiences, which, Ryan, you talked about, cultural background, or specific viewpoints. Biases can be positive or negative and aren't necessarily harmful. Where a prejudice is more severe, where I would say at that point, when you hear someone say millennials are more narcissistic, that becomes to me sounding more prejudice than if I would say as a bias, I feel that they don't want to work as hard. I feel that Gen Z just don't want to, give their 40 hours a week. Mm-hmm. Then we go to action, and that's where we get discrimination. So if I'm thinking that Gen Z does not, let's say I'm gonna go more towards the prejudice side. I'm gonna say, hey, Gen Z, they're lazy. They don't care about doing quality of work. And you know what? I'm running a project. I'm heading a project, and I'm not going to ask my younger teammates who are sitting in the middle of 20s, because I don't want them on my project in case they don't show up and bring their best. Now I'm discriminating against them.
Prejudging.
And so I think what's important is you have to think of it as a pathway. It starts with a stereotype, kind of a generalized, and then you either move to a bias or a prejudice. If it's more severe, it's going to be prejudice. Now, with a bias, it could just stop there. Usually then prejudices then move into, now I'm starting to discriminate. And here's the funny thing. I asked myself, do I do that? And I went, you bet I do that. You know when I do that? Technology. I wouldn't say, okay, so here's smiling. I hate that you know me that way. I really do. But what do I do when I'm like, I told this story, the first thing I think is, where's somebody young? That's what I do. Mm-hmm. Or I've said, I need a millennial.
No technology. Huh? That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's like there's very few millennials that didn't grow up with it. We're tech natives. I like to use
exactly
the term. And Gen Z understand a lot, even more than I do, because they're
we were we entered adulthood at the rise of social media and smartphones
and computers, like laptops. I mean, I didn't get a laptop until like my sophomore year of college, I think, or junior year of college.
Yeah, but for you, I've seen it. It's like fire bells go off.
Oh, you betcha they do.
You were drowning.
I'm drowning, and I it's like I can't even, I don't have enough reference and muscle memory to be able to do this. I mean, poor Ryan gets hit by me all the time. Now, if I moved and if Dana said, well, I might be able to help you, who's my coworker, and she's a little bit younger than me, and I'd go, no, that's okay, Dana. I would rather just go ask somebody younger. Now I'm discriminating against her.
Dana understands a lot of stuff.
She does. Yeah. So that's where I started to go, most of the time I probably don't jump into the discriminatory part of on that, but I'm definitely biased. I'm biased towards people who are younger, who I know. I watch it, and it's from experience watching my own sons. And I'd be like, guys, slow down. I can't catch on that quick. What are you doing? But for you guys, it's second nature.
Well, I think something that's interesting too is you're super self-aware, because you're constantly thinking through these things right here. But I want to talk a little bit about how can we avoid making some of these judgmental characteristics. But maybe for someone who's listening, they're like, well, I don't do that. That's not a problem I face. But maybe let's shatter the glass a little bit and let's call out some of the judgments and characteristics from each of the generations. What are some things that you've heard? Let's just kind of go through, maybe starting with traditionalists to boomers.
Okay, so you want to know what boomers might say about other generations?
Yeah, what would
besides
what do boomers say about traditionalists? I know we don't have too many of them left in the workforce, but there may be a few.
They'd be 78, 79 now. They would say, I've definitely caught myself, closed-minded, doesn't want to see other points of view.
Not open to change.
Yeah, definitely don't want, definitely, listen to me, definitely. Not wanting to take on technology, always saying, things were much better in my era. I would say those are things I've definitely caught myself saying.
What's interesting is that's the almost verbatim exactly what I'd say about boomers.
You bet it would be.
Yeah.
Now, you see who we're skipping through this whole thing? Are those little Gen Xers.
The forgotten generation.
The forgotten generation.
Yeah.
The smallest group of people in that generation who are just probably, they say Gen Xers are just like, we just watch the war go on between the baby boomers and the millennials.
Other stereotypes I've heard is just lack of emotion or empathy.
For baby boomers?
For Gen X.
Oh, for Gen X. You're interesting.
Interesting, because I was like, what are some stereotypes? It's like, honestly, I've tried to remove those, but looking into it was like, I've read the opposite about Gen X.
Yeah.
I've read that they're highly empathetic and they totally understand because they lived in that space between the boomers and the millennials and are more go with the flow kind of. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay.
The other thing I've heard about Gen X is they're kind of the creators of wanting a lot of work-life balance. I mean, millennials pushed it.
They actually drove a lot of when you research when that language started entering into the workforce, actually it was some boomers that even were driving it, which is fascinating because we get blamed or looked at as millennials as thinking that we're the ones that don't want to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps kind of thing. But yeah, that actually Gen Z or Gen X's are when that language and those initiatives started coming into the workforce was from Gen X. And before that even, but that's really where it took off.
So where are you guys catching yourself making some stereotypes on on Gen Zs?
Well,
let's talk about the stereotypes of other millennials, and then let's get to
millennials.
Gen Z.
Yeah, okay.
Let's talk about us. What do you think about millennials?
Definitely, they need a pat on their back. This is what I definitely was somebody who probably set that before my awareness of things because I heard it, not because I experienced it.
Yeah,
so it's become what we call a limiting belief. I believe it because externally it was brought to my attention, and then I went, and then that feeds into confirmation bias.
Yeah,
right. It feeds into confirmation bias to go. Now I'm looking for it. I'm looking for what these other people say. Because I remember thinking, well, how do you know that? Where are you coming up with that they need to have these trophies and this acknowledgement? Guess what? Every human being wants to be acknowledged. That is not something that happened in 1979 and went, we should do this. We should say, hey, good job, Ryan. Good job, Nick.
Yeah. But what's fascinating, okay, I know this is a sidebar. Fascinating, as a millennial, I forget to tell my team that they're doing a good job. Like when I was managing and leading people, I just didn't think people should have to be told that.
Yeah.
I'm a millennial. That's not something that I've never felt like. I actually get uncomfortable when people pat me on the back. Just to shatter a little, but I'm the exception of the rule, of course.
Right.
But when we start doing that enough, we start to go, okay, what is the rule here? Okay, I know we want to keep talking about the biases, but I think that's...
What are the things millennials... pampered, kind of helicoptered by their parents. I guess where their parents are.
Yeah.
Baby boomers.
You've created us.
I know that.
You created a monster.
Yes. Now live with it. Right. Yeah.
I mean, I've experienced that too. So I worked in the college world, worked a lot with Gen Z as they were growing up. I know maybe we're not talking about... Can we talk about Gen Zs now?
Sure.
Can I talk? Okay. The lawnmower parent. You brought that up and made me think. Those are both Gen Xers and boomers that had these kids that I was responsible for in different roles I held. And I experienced that. I experienced while I worked in Asia, we call them tiger moms as well. Like they're coming in and they want the best for their kid. And so they're going to fight you left and right to make sure their kid gets X, Y, Z. And I hear my friends talk about this as teachers. They talk about how, back in the day, it used to be the teacher was right, the student was wrong and needed correction. I've heard this enough that I think this is a real trend. Now, maybe because of distrust and all of this different narratives that we're saying, it's the kid is right, the parent is right, the parent or the teacher needs to bend to whatever the parent says. So if your kid got a C on the test, well, it's probably because the teacher is wrong.
There is some arbitrary stuff, yeah.
So those are like the narratives that I'm hearing about. I mean, I think that's the stereotype I have around boomers and some Gen Xers around how they're parenting their kids is that helicopter, but actually lawnmower parents is the stereotype where the idea is you mow over any difficulty or stress that your kid might experience so you can kind of bubble wrap them through life.
Interesting.
That's the stereotype
Or you don't have to take anything. You don't have to look at yourself. We're just going to move forward, regardless. Regardless of the rock.
I don't know how true that is. I experienced that myself, and talking to my friends, that's the case. But for whatever reason, there's this significant fear from these different parents coming in, kind of lawnmowing over any difficulty that their kid might be experiencing.
And I would say that has nothing to do with the generation. That has to do with a culture shift, a shift in the way we look at teachers. Like you said, trust. I think that has to do more about values, cultural norms that don't look the same now than they did back then. And
but I think we see those. I think we start to see the trajectory of value shifting with each generation. And again, I think it's in response and reaction to our experiences. It's in response and reaction to the Vietnam War or to the market crash in 2008.
Watergate.
To Watergate, to social media, to the way press has shifted, the way that now news is a 24-hour news cycle when it used to be 8 hours.
And news is no longer, it's more entertainment. Where when I grew up, news, when you watched, I know this is really going to age me, David Brinkley and Walter Cronkite, it was like serious, no goofiness.
Not a bunch of talking heads kind of thing. Everybody's throwing in their opinion. Now, I think there's some benefit to that, but that you're having more perspectives and more voices to discuss. But I do think, again, when you think about generations and values starting to shift and understanding, is we're reacting to our experiences, and that's what starts to shift our culture.
And the culture changes. Right?
Yeah, so
the culture
we react,
changes.
and then our values start to shift.
Well, we talked a little bit about biases of each generation, and I know we could probably keep talking about that for a while. I mean, I remember one time having a conversation with someone who's obviously a boomer, and he was, not part of this organization, but part of a different organization, and he was sitting there telling me about the downfalls of millennials, and like, oh, those millennials are so lazy, and I'm like, I'm a millennial.
But you're an exception to the rule now.
Yeah.
It's like, am I lazy?
Did you say that to them?
I did. I was like, I'm a millennial.
And what did they say?
He was like, oh, well,
I'm just saying. Yeah.
So I think there's, there's obviously some truths because, like you said, we're reacting to cultural shifts. But there's also dangers to that.
A lot of dangers.
And so I want to talk about generations in the workplace. Because it's never changing. It's new generations are constantly coming in. When we threw around the idea of nobody ever wanting to work, we do have the video. You want to show the video?
Yeah, let's watch the video.
This is for those of you. This might be quite interesting to see.
A brief history of nobody wants to work anymore. 2024. What has happened to the work ethic in America? Nobody wants to work anymore. 2006. I can't believe the bad luck I've had. Nobody wants to work anymore. 1999. Nobody wants to work anymore. Cecil said they all want to work in front of a computer and make lots of money. 1981. I hired 2 boys to clear the rocks off the land last week, but they just fooled around. They didn't want to work. Nobody wants to work anymore. 1979. Nobody wants to work anymore. Disgusted businessman. 1952. I heard somebody say the other day that everybody is getting too darn lazy and nobody wants to work anymore. That's the truth if I ever heard it. 1937. Peach orchardists in York and Adams counties are complaining that nobody wants to work anymore. 1922. The manufacturer and businessmen say it is because nobody wants to work anymore. 1916. The reason for food scarcity is that nobody wants to work as hard as they used to. 1905. Labor is scarce, high, and very unreliable. None want to work for wages. 1894. With all the mines of the country shut down by strikers, what will the poor editor do for coal next winter? It is becoming apparent that nobody wants to work these hard times.
Wow.
What will the poor editor do for coal?
I don't know.
My favorite line. That was from a video by Josh Green on TikTok. Thank you, Josh. What do you think about that?
That to me is, if that doesn't solidify everything we're talking about, it's just to debunk the whole idea that all of a sudden this younger group doesn't want to work, because I know we said that about millennials. I mean, that went back to 1894, guys. I mean...
I saw somebody do a reaction to this video. There's different versions floating around and go, maybe we need to start to ask the question, maybe they just don't want to work for you.
Yeah,
That's
right.
Maybe your real problem is I love excuse me, one of the examples was like, I hired 2 young boys to clean out rocks from my yard, and then all they did was fool around. And then we extrapolate that to nobody wants to work anymore.
Well, I mean,
that's hilarious.
Let's look at the expectation gap and just the mindset of work and just the motivation behind it. You think about back in 1894, what did a gasoline cost? A nickel?
Well, don't look at me. I wasn't born yet, but thank you.
Let's talk about.
Did we have gas? Was there gas?
Yeah. There wasn't even cars yet.
Was when the car, when cars.
Let's talk about in the 80s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah. When I was driving, how much
let's
gas
talk about
was?
cost of living and what was your motivation for work? I mean, could you afford life?
Well, I mean, I think, I will say this. Cost of living is not equated to the cost of living when I was growing up. It is much more expensive than it was when I was growing up. I mean, that's just the truth. Inflation and such. That said, I mean, I worked 2 jobs to get through college. Now you can work 2 jobs and you won't get through college. You're going to be doing that for about 15 years before that.
Yeah.
I just think the motivation was because I wanted, but here's the thing. Let me just talk about that for a minute. When I was in my early 20s, I remember thinking, okay, I'll get married and probably have a house before 30, easily before 30. And now we've got 30-year-olds who are like, I'm not going to get a house. If I get a house, maybe in my 40s. So there's some huge disparity there.
Yeah, I think if we're bringing this together, there's something called fundamental attribution error. The example that's easy is we look at somebody that cuts us off. Somebody did that to me this morning, actually. And you don't want to know what I said when this person cut me off. But where does my mind go? Idiot driver, terrible driver, stupid, all this stuff, all these morally deficient, terrible human being, whoever that is out there. But when I cut somebody off, well, I was in a hurry. Oops, didn't see you there. Yeah. Right? I am a victim of my circumstances, my context, you were in my blind spot, whatever that is. So fundamental attribution error is kind of what we're seeing and what we're talking about here. Is basically I look at the other generation and I see their low motivation. And I see, because, we're talking about these circumstances that many are going up. It's just where it is. You could talk to somebody that went through the Great Depression. Think about how demoralizing that would be to go through an experience like
when you
that.
had 25% unemployment, and we have about 4%.
Yeah. So
it's not apples to apples.
It's not apples to apples, and that's going to be an incredibly formative thing. See, but so then you go through that experience, and you go, well, I was going through this, and I was a victim of these circumstances. I did the best I could with what I had. But see, then I look at the next generation, and I go, idiot driver.
Yeah,
you're a terrible driver. How do you not have more motivation? How do you not this? How do you not that? And so I think in many ways, when we start to look at the most unhelpful use of these labels and these things, is when we look at somebody else and say, well, it's because of some moral deficiency that you have. Not because of your circumstances.
And we forget that we were 22, didn't have a whole lot of life behind us, right?
Stage of life and maturity that I'm at.
Exactly. And I know I was immature, thought I could conquer the world and I was going to be all that. And, humility in life will put you back on track very quickly.
Yeah, and I... because this is a very millennial thing to say. I did my research on TikTok, and so I watched a bunch of just kind of mindsets and perspectives from a lot of Gen Zs who are entering the workforce and their lack of motivation because they cannot afford life.
That's right.
They don't see the point in working 40 plus hours a week and still having nothing in your bank account at the end of the month.
That's so interesting.
You can't even afford rent and gas. And then, a lot of the older generations will look down on them and say, well, just pull yourself up.
Stop buying Starbucks.
Yeah, stop buying Starbucks. The whole Dave Ramsey plan, if he ever listens to this, I'm sorry, but just, red beans and rice. Just live on red beans and rice. Well, what kind of quality of life is that when you're telling someone just entering the workforce who's got all of their dreams ahead of us that you need to sacrifice and starve yourself in order to make it in this world?
That's interesting, because I didn't have to. I had to work hard, but I still could do things, and I worked an extra job because I wanted a few things. But that's very interesting what you're saying, Nick, because that's what my kids say. I'm not motivated to work anywhere because I don't get anywhere. I don't move.
There's nowhere to move forward.
I'm not going to be able to get a home.
Yeah. So I might as well make the best out of the situation I'm in right now. That's so interesting. That's what I see. Because then I watch Gen Zs, and I think the other piece is like, yeah, okay, you're still making not good decisions around where you're spending your money. Buying Starbucks every day is not necessarily a good idea when you're not sure if you're going to be able to buy gas tomorrow, right? But I think where we get into, and not that we're getting into quote unquote a poverty mindset, but if you, like now we're looking at real stuff. Poverty mindset says, well, I'm never going to get ahead in life, so I might as well make the best of the situation I have now. And so not that maybe all millennials are thinking that way, but that's what I'm hearing, and that's a very real thing. And if you were to really put yourself in their place, guess what? Then the reality is you might just have the same reaction. No, but most of us would go, no, I'm better than that. No, you're not. You're actually not. We all fall prey, and it is really hard to move beyond that viewpoint, to move beyond that. But at the same time, there still has to be self-ownership and go, okay, yeah, I need to make different decisions if I want to do something. Yeah. And my I can point all day at my circumstances and blame my circumstances, but at the end of the day, I have to make choices that are going to move me forward. And so that would be my challenge to anyone, not just Gen Zs, because I meet people every day, regardless of their generation, that are in that same mindset.
It's true. Yeah, I want to shift the conversation a little bit with the time we have left, to get away from the biases, and let's focus on the strengths. Because obviously, if we just focus too much on the biases and the misunderstandings and the myths of each generation, that we're just adding fuel to the fire. But in reality is I've even had my own internal bias against Gen Zs and older generations, and until I really got to work with them and got to know them and got to understand them. And it's not necessarily a generational thing, because each person has their own strengths, characteristics, skill set, gifts. And then once you kind of break that barrier, it's like, okay, you're actually a very competent person. You may be 15 years younger than me, but very competent person. You're going to make it far in this life. So I want to talk about what can we do, because millennials, we're entering middle management into some senior management positions. Boomers are senior management,
and retiring.
Gen X is kind of up there as well. And what can we do as leaders? And if you're a leader of younger generations or all generations, how can we, what would you say, to tap into the strengths of each generation, or focus on the individual strengths as a person?
Well, that's where I was going to go, just based on what you said, Nick. I think you've got to get past what we're really saying here is ageism, which is a federally protected right, is to not look at the person based on their age, but their talents, their strengths, their natural gifts that they do. What is it how are they impacting? And, when I think about, when I'm working with Ryan, how much I've learned from him, and he's a very thoughtful leader, and he and I can get into some really good conversations. I love that synergy. I don't think of him like, oh, well, he's 35 and 36, whatever you are, 35 years old. I look at him, he's a thought leader, and I think that's what we have to recognize, not go, he's a millennial. For me personally, I'm trying to pull in my own awareness to mitigate some of those things. Not going to be perfect by any means, but appreciate what And I think that's what we have to do is even somebody who's 25. I mean, my son's 24, and he's been just sharing some new ways of how to be much more cognizant about privacy. Well, guess what? I wouldn't have thought about that really. I know you hear about it, but he is like, no, Mom, you got to protect your stuff. And so he's teaching me, and I have a new respect for that. So that's what I would say.
Yeah.
One of the things I really appreciate from you, Lorraine, and from so one of the things I think my bias and potentially judgment that would with older generations is you can't teach me anything, and that's I think a little bit of my personality as well.
If you say that from older generations,
because there's this rejection of actually this idea, and I think maybe other millennials out there and probably Gen Zs are feeling the same way. Probably because of the stories I heard people telling about quote unquote my generation. And so my personal reaction to that was, oh, you think you're all that? Mm-hmm. Well, let me show you. And so I shut myself off to this idea that there was any wisdom or experience or opportunity.
Very interesting because I, as also a millennial, maybe just elder millennial, I'm exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
And when it comes to peer-to-peer interaction or someone I'm learning from someone younger than me, I internally have a bias of you can't teach me anything.
From somebody who's
younger or peer-to-peer. I am looking to older generations and expecting their wisdom.
Now, how much of that drives from your military experience?
That's probably right. There's a cultural thing there, you know. Yep. I'm looking to those who are above me.
That's right.
To show me the way.
That's right.
Yeah, I think there's different factors. There's so many factors that play into all of that. But that was something I had to work through because guess what? Other millennials that feel the same way as me or Gen Zs, the people that have been in these businesses and working in these places, they do have things that you need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
you really do. And there's some stuff you don't learn in a book, right? And I think that's where boomers and whatever are looking at us, and they would be right in saying, be more open, like, listen, come on. But here's the thing. If you're going to come at me, boomer, in a way of, oh, you're an idiot, millennial, lazy, whatever, do you think I'm going to be open?
Right.
You think I'm going to be open to hearing what you have to say to me?
You're going to be defensive.
No. You've already prejudged me, prejudiced, right, against me.
Yeah.
So you're treating me and speaking to me in a way that's incredibly disrespectful to who I am and my capacity and ability. And so what are the strengths? Well, I've worked with some incredible Gen Zs. So I used to work in a college. And actually, probably some of them were right on the cusp between millennial and Gen Z. And I still know many of them. And they are incredible leaders. Far surpassed me, I would say, in many ways, in their ability. And so if you're a leader or you're a person in the organization, one of the biggest things that I think is a litmus test of your ability to lead is, regardless of generation, regardless of experience, are you creating more leaders, or are you diminishing? And and I think that's a generation person, not a wholly generational thing. I think it's a thing that we do out of insecurity as we diminish the people around us, and we use generational labels to do that. It's a tool of which we use to try to diminish and make ourselves more and others less. Not to get into the biases, but okay, so look at the strengths. I saw some incredibly creative Gen Zs that prioritize. Yes, they had lots to learn from me, but I had things to learn from them. And I think I like the way you put that, Lorraine, on a practical sense, but also from a creative, they know of so many resources and things out there that I wasn't aware of. That they could tap into, and they were even more efficient. And I was actually very annoyed with them because they would get their work done in an hour and a half, and I'm still sitting there toiling away. Yeah. Because I think for anybody tech native or going up, they are naturally inclined towards shortcuts. And we look at them and go, lazy. Well, could we flip our brain and go, that's incredibly efficient.
That's lean and efficient.
Yeah.
And I think one other thing that we're really talking about is the diversity of ages brings such a wealth. Just think about if the place was all baby boomers, you know, we'd be working 60 hours a week because we wake, right?
Yeah. If the place was all Gen Z.
There we go.
2-day work week.
There we go.
5-day weekend.
And no.
Which sounds awesome.
Yeah, I know it does.
Studies show 4-day work week
It does.
is very
And I'm
possible for many organizations.
Yeah. That's super interesting. So thinking through the strengths of each generation, and do you have any tips or tools for maybe some of the leaders to try not to focus on your own internal bias and put people into labels?
Yeah, I don't know. One of the things that I coach along all the time is be curious about people. Just be interested. Like I said, I've learned so much from working next to Ryan, because I just allowed myself to be curious. He's got a different lens of life that is newer. I have it longer, but he's a little bit newer in let's just say technology or new ways of thinking. And I think what we have to do is come and show up and be curious, not in a snarky way, but curious to go, that's interesting. Where does that come from? And I with you too, Nic, there's been times where you've shared things I go, I never even thought about that, I guess that's.
Yeah, I think a tool to overcome confirmation bias. When I think about when we it's hard for us to remove these labels. They've been out there, right? Yeah. Gen Z, we love, again, to label and categorize, and those are just always going to be out there. But one of the tools that I use to challenge my confirmation bias when I see something and I then zero in on that and go, okay, now let me look for everything that fits that narrative, fits that label. The question to ask myself is, what if the opposite were true? What information would tell me that?
That's right. And what's the evidence?
So I did that with a Gen Z colleague of mine in the past. I'm not always good at this, but I have a bias and judgment against Gen Zs. I'm sorry, Gen Zs, but I do. I've struggled at times because, again, there are differences. We feel them. There's different values, and I think it sometimes is more individual person than it is even generational differences. But the question I had to start asking myself was, okay, are they lazy? What evidence would show me that they're not?
And then it's
what if the opposite
lazy.
were true? Define what lazy
right means. And because you're going to have in your mind, this is what somebody looks like who's working proficiently, and if they don't fall within that, then they're lazy.
You want to know what it actually was? The role and function they were in was not motivating to them.
Yeah, so they're...
Guess what? Is that lazy, or were they just in the wrong seat?
Yeah.
See, so if I decided they were lazy, that is a moral judgment and defining characteristic about them. Yes. But guess what? Get them in the right seat, watch them take off.
Absolutely. Right?
And so here, again, back to the danger. I've met so many Gen Zs that have completely been incredibly driven. Yes, are they efficient? Yes, do they have different work-life balance thinking than I do? Yes, they do. Sometimes I have to challenge and push that against that because we got to develop this grit and drive. Stuff doesn't always come easy because, yes, technology has made us feel and think that things come easier than they do sometimes. So we got to challenge and push against that. But they're not lazy. There's a difference.
Ryan, we got to tell the story about my friend Ryan.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is an incredible story. I have a friend who I went to high school with. Her youngest son is Ryan, and Ryan is a Gen Z. He's 24 years old, and he was going to Amsterdam to get his master's in psychology, and he found out that he was accepted in February. Not I don't even know if it was this year or last year. And he had to raise about $4,500 and he was leaving to go to Amsterdam in June, the very beginning of June, and it was February. So he's trying to think, and he's going, Chipotle isn't cutting it. I'm not going to be able to hit my goal. So he came up with a business for the months. He actually didn't kick off the business till April. So he did it for April and May, about 6 to 8 weeks. He researched it in the months of February and March, and that was doing a
power washing.
Power washing.
Yeah.
never did power washing in his life. Okay. So he researches this. What does he do? He goes and he calls in power washing companies to come to the house under the pretense that, we're thinking about my mom's thinking about having her driveway power washed, just to engage and find out what their business was like so that he could understand how to go out. He had no car. He built this sort of wagon thing. He figured out from YouTube what chemicals needed. And he had a bike, and he had a tow bar, and he towed this wagon with chemicals, and he went house to house. He got a shirt that had his logo on it. He only one shirt, said who he was, and he made more than enough money, and then sold the business for a profit.
Wow.
Right?
But he's an exception to the rule.
Oh, yeah.
Gen Zs are lazy.
That's right. See?
Oh, come on.
Right?
Yeah.
Isn't that an amazing story? Mm-hmm. And there's a Gen Z. So, and you're right. People would go, but Ryan's a special kid.
Yeah.
He is an incredible young man, but he's still, wow.
That's brilliant. And I think two things that you guys touched on that really struck to me, including that story, is that we're all trying to get to the same place. We may have different ways of getting there, different philosophies around how we get there.
That's right, Nick.
But we're all trying to get to the same place. We're all just trying to make it. And I think what you said about respect, and I feel like internally, we all want respect, right? We don't want to be disrespected. We don't want to be lumped into generational norms and then treated differently.
Right.
We want respect.
Which is a loaded word.
It's a loaded word.
Yeah.
You see me.
But what I also loved about what you said, Lorraine, was stay curious. And if you, even as a participant in the podcast listening, feel yourself challenged at all, or when you're dealing with other generations in the workplace and you feel yourself challenged by, the bias that you're feeling against them, get curious for yourself, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the ways to do that is engage and ask questions. When you say that you only want to work 3 days a week in a world that works 4 days or 5 days a week, help me understand how would that work for you? How do you make that? Not like, how's that going to work for you?
It's just not how it works.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. One thing I want to say is this before we end wrap things up. The tech gurus of the world, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, what generation were they? Let me think. Baby boomers.
Really, honorary millennials. That's what they are.
Yeah, right. We like to claim them.
Oh,
yeah, you can have
sorry, they're too old.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I remember having a conversation in one of our recent podcasts on mental health just about Generation Alpha, because they're going to be entering the workforce in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
That's my kids. And
That's right.
they have their own language now?
Yeah,
That's a whole other episode.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't wait to hear about that. I don't even know
their
that.
own language that they're speaking.
Wild, yeah.
It doesn't make sense, and it makes my children cringe when I try to do it. Yeah. Well, they're going to be entering the workplace, and so the dynamics are even going to shift even more in the next 10 years.
Is this new language on Duolingo? Because okay.
Yeah.
Okay, boomer. Yeah.
Hey, I was just trying to use an app that I just discovered.
But I think this it's changing.
Yeah.
Constantly, and as generations retire out and new generations come in, we're going to have a whole new set of biases that we're going to have to work against. But stay curious, right? And be respectful. Anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think the whole generation question is like, okay, so we talked about why they exist. We like to categorize how they can lead to biases and whatever. But I would say they can be helpful. I think that's the biggest thing. We notice clear differences between the generations. So they can start to give us some insights. But I think I just encourage you to look at the experiences, dial back
and
to the experiences and how that's influenced the values of people, because then I think that will help us move towards empathy and understanding where they're coming from, and what has shaped how they view work, how they view life in general. And that, I think, will help you move towards better understanding how I can engage with these individuals.
I think what you just said is so right. I love that you're moving those thoughts towards being more empathetic. A story about a traditionalist, my ex-husband's grandmother. They found over 2,000 spools of thread in her basement with no thread, just the spools, empty spools, 2,000 of them. And, he's like, Grandma, what are you going to do with all these spools? Now, she's a traditionalist. Guess what time era that she lived in? As a child, she lived in during the Depression. Mm-hmm. And she said, David, you know what? You just never know. I might have to use those spools of thread, or not thread, but the spools for firewood. So here's the mindset. Yeah, we're laughing at that, but guess what? Yeah. That's how they had to think. How could when they lost so much and they didn't have very much, everything had value. Mm-hmm. We're a throwaway society. Mm-hmm. Good grief, mm-hmm. and that group of people held on to everything because maybe I could sell it and we could get some money for food or gas in the car or whatever. So again, I think it's not so much the generation, but looking at the influences, the external influences, and our own personalities and our own talents, and keeping those very, very general ways that we look at the generations to that. Very general.
Yeah. I mean, that's fantastic. I think it's a great final word, too. And I think it's important to remember that people are our biggest commodity, and we should be looking at people the way that she looked at spools of thread.
Yeah.
You can't toss them out, and we got to work on our retention. We've got to work on decreasing our turnover. So understanding the different generations and how they work, but then overcoming the biases against them and trying to tap into each person's individual strengths and accomplishments and wisdom and skills and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I would throw the challenge out this. In the next week, how about all of us do this? How about we all look at our own teammates, our own co-workers differently, and maybe spend 5 minutes with somebody that maybe you haven't, and be curious, be respectful, and ask them if there's something that they say that makes you kind of twinge, instead of kind of getting reactive about it, tell me more about that. What is it that you see, as opposed to shutting it down? So I'm throwing the gauntlet out there to see what can happen with that.
Challenge has been thrown.
All right.
If you end up doing that, we'd love to hear how it went for you. Email us at on frontlineon.com. We'd love to know more. If you want help, kind of navigating different generations in your workplace and talking with your team, we'd definitely love to talk with you as well. You can learn more at frontlineon.com, as well as a lot of the other solutions that we have available there to overcome the challenges that are keeping you and your coworkers and your employers up at night. So thank you so much,
Ryan.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Behind the Frontline.